Welcome back, Photoshop students. I'm going to introduce you to working with your type tool. The type tool is located here in the toolbar. We're going to talk about the type tool, the options available, the adjustments that you can select in the options bar. We'll talk a little bit about working with the character and paragraph floating panels, and also introduce you to changing layer styles and blending options in the layers panel. So let's get started. Working with type is not my favorite thing to do in Photoshop. I actually prefer to use type-based programs that are meant to work with type and vector graphics a little better, like Illustrator or InDesign. However, you should know what type tools are available to you in Adobe Photoshop as well. So let's just take a look. If I choose the type tool in the toolbar over here, I have a few options before me. I can horizontal type normally, type vertically, use the mask tool, or the vertical type mask tool. So let's just type horizontally normally and just see what happens. So if I click anywhere in the image window, click, I get this little blinking line, and that lets me know about the general size of the type I'm about to work with. If I look above in the tool options bar, you can see that I've selected typeface Helvetica in the regular style as opposed to oblique, bold, narrow. And you can just kind of switch through those. Notice how this is still blinking. It still knows that I'm about to type, and it also has automatically created in the layers panel a new layer for me, a type layer. So that's another thing to know, is that it automatically creates a type layer for you. Here's where I select my type size, and I highly suggest that you select a type size before you begin typing, because otherwise it can just be out of hand and just way too big, and you may not even be able to see what you're typing. So you can kind of get an idea by the blinking what size you're dealing with here. And this is the anti-aliasing, which we'll talk about in just a moment. You get to choose left align, center align, or right align, as well as setting a text color. Note when I click, it brings up my color panel, and I can choose to mix a color here in the color picker, or I can constrain it to web colors if I'd like, and select a color to type with. Maybe we'll just choose something more interesting to show you. We'll just choose a blue and hit OK. And now I can begin typing on the keyboard. So here I've set type in a blue color. Now, the anti-aliasing, which I said I was going to speak of, can be set if I click and drag to select this entire line of text, or triple click to select an entire line of text. I can change the anti-aliasing. Right now it's set to sharp. Watch what happens if I choose smooth. Now you may not be able to see, depending on how pixelated this video looks by the time it gets to you. But I typically will work with smooth anti-aliasing when I'm designing comps and layouts for web design. And all that does is it dithers the edge of the type to the background color so that it looks a little bit more smooth. Look what happens when I choose triple click to select all of the type. If I choose none and I deselect the type line, you can see now there's a big difference. It's very blocky. It's just made of individual squares or pixels. So anti-aliasing can be selected in your tool options bar. I can change the typeface here. So let's go back to a nice smooth anti-alias. You can change typefaces here. You can get some rather interesting ones that maybe you've downloaded or purchased online. And what's cool is using the tool options bar, I have a little bit of a sample on the right. So it helps me to remember. Even though I may be familiar with most of my typefaces, it helps me to kind of remember what they look like as I scroll through and select a typeface. And then I can choose the size of the type. There's a nice drop down menu. It lets me choose the size of the type. And that's all available to me in the type options bar. Now, if I want to bring up my character and paragraph floating panels, of course you can go under Window and then make sure that character is checked. That's one way. Another way, let's redo what I just did there. Another way to choose to bring up the character and paragraph floating panels if they're not showing is with your type tool selected, you can actually bring up the floating panels on the far right of the options bar by clicking on this little icon here. Boom, there they are. They have returned. Now notice how if I sort of miss clicking and dragging on the type layer that I just made, it'll create a new text box for me. So it's a little bit touchy, the image window, when you have the type tool selected. It's a little bit touchy. Let's see that again. So there's a difference between clicking on and selecting type when you are really near to its type line. And you can click and drag and select and change the typeface, change the anti-aliasing. Okay, so there's a difference though when you go and try to select with the type tool and you're not close enough to that type line. If I click and drag, now it's made what is called a text box, which means it's going to constrain anything that I type. It's going to constrain it within that box. So there's a difference between simply clicking with the type tool and clicking and dragging with the type tool. So here's a click, one click, and I can begin to type. Okay? Now, with the text tool selected, I click and drag and create a text box. So it's a very subtle difference there. I'm going to throw that in the trash. The other thing that I wanted to show you about the type tool is, let me delete what I've done here. Here are two examples. This is a headline example, and this is a body copy. And I'm just using Greeking for this example, little lorem ipsum. And you can actually, using the layers panel, hide and show type layers just like you would any other normal layer. You do have more options available to you in the character and paragraph floating panels. So, for example, say I wanted to make some adjustments to this headline here. I can click or triple click to click and select the entire line. And you can see that I can also change the typeface. I can change the type style. I can change the type size. I can change the leading, which is the space between the lines. I can change the space between the letters. Sometimes working with headline text, it's kind of nice to be able to space those letter forms a little bit, give them a little bit of breathing room. So sometimes it's great to choose with headline text somewhere between 10 and 25. Just to give it a little bit of breathing room so that so the letter forms don't look so cramped. I can also scale the type, so I can make it, very fat if I wanted to, in the horizontal direction. I can scale it vertically, make it tall. So I can tweak things a lot more. I can actually set the type so that it's superscript. like if we were typing in some sort of data that required superscript. I can also change the color. If I click once in the color, it brings up the color picker. And then I have some options here that are actually like the italic and the bold. These are false bold and false italic selections. You can choose the real bolding and italic in the font style drop-down menu. These are the ones that come with the font, and these are the ones that are actually recommended, making it bold or italic. But not all typefaces come with in a font suitcase or a font set, come with these selections. So in that case, you could use a false bold, in which Photoshop tries to mimic or render a bold, or a false italic. Now, all caps will change the typeface to all caps. And here's a really fun one that I like to work with a lot when working with headings, small caps. So it makes the differentiation between the capital letter form and the smaller letter forms, except that the small lowercase letter forms actually are uppercase. And that's kind of an interesting option. It doesn't look that great with Helvetica in this case, because you can see that the letter forms aren't as thick as the first character in each word. So that would not be the best choice with this particular typeface. Superscript and subscript also available here. You can underline type, which is great for mocking up comps of web pages and you want to show what's a clickable bit of type or a link. And then strike through. Say you're editing something and you come in and you want to show that we should cut this part out, you can have that strike through option. And then there are choices of languages, and you can also adjust your anti-aliasing in the character floating panel. Also, the paragraph floating panel is located here, and they're usually grouped together by default in Photoshop. Let's look at a paragraph of type. If I click and drag, I can select it all. Or I can do a Command A or Control A to select all. And then I can, center the type, which in this case looks very bad. Right justified. This is something that you might see in a lot of newspaper text. It's a justified text in which the final line is left aligned, which is different from this justified text in which the final line is centered. So you do have justification options here, as well as you can change the amount of which text is indented. You can change the margins. As you can see, I can click and drag to the right, and it is changing the margin in that block of type in my image window. I can set margins. I can also set the first line indent. So if this is my first line, I can click in front of it, click and drag, and now you can see as I click and drag to the right, it is changing it so the first line is indented. And I can do the same here. I think it was about 8.6 to make them equal. So you do have some of these options available to you at how much space you want to add between paragraphs, how much space you want to add after paragraphs, how hyphenation is handled. By default, automatic hyphenation is checked unless you want more or need more control over the way text is hyphenated. But remember, Photoshop is not generally recommended for typesetting. You would more likely use a program like InDesign for working with large blocks of type. But it's good to know that all of these options are available. And then you do have some of these in the context menu as well. You can see there's the faux bold, the faux italic, all caps, small caps, which we've talked about. All of these options we've talked about are available here. But here's an interesting one that I did not talk about yet, and that is fractional widths. You can actually make correct fractions by working with Photoshop, and that's one of the options that's available to you. But we'll go over that in a later type demonstration. So this is just a general introduction to working with type. So as you continue working with type, you want to also keep in mind that you do have the availability of changing the leading and kerning between the characters. So leading deals with the space between the lines when you've got a block of text. So if I decided, and I generally like to put a little more spacing, add a little bit more leading, the general recommendation for leading is to type whatever the type size is, it's 1.5 points more than the type size. And that is the minimum amount of leading that you would use. If I want to increase the leading, I can select all by clicking and dragging, or Control A or Command A. And now I can up the leading a little bit. And you can see how that sets the text so that it has a little bit more breathing room in between the lines, and it makes it a little bit more legible, a little bit easier to read. You also have the ability to change the space between the letters, and sometimes that really comes into play when you're working with headlines. So we've already given this headline some more breathing room by increasing the tracking for the entire set of characters. But if you wanted to increase the tracking or the kerning between two letters in particular, you have to actually select two characters. So if I decide that the space between the T and the Y is okay, but the space between the Y and the P is not okay, and I put my little target here and click between those two letters, then I should be able to increase the space between the two letters. And now I think that they're a little more reasonable, a little bit more similar, and it reads better. And you really only see this level of granularity between two letter forms when you're working with headlines. You really don't see that much in blocks of text. So that's changing the kerning or the spacing between two particular letter forms. And that's basically it as far as this very, very basic introduction in working with type. You do have the option to have vertical type, and we can just kind of show you how that works here. And as you can see, it might actually work better if you work with all caps. Let's try. I'll click away. I'm going to select the Move tool, and that just gets me out of working in the Type tool. And you can see that if I use all caps, that their width is consistent and similar. So it actually looks like a little bit better vertical type than the capital with the lowercase. And also the Move tool, when a type layer is selected, the Move tool allows you to move these elements around. So I can select a particular layer and move it around. I can move the headline around as well within the Layers panel. And of course you do have all of the blending options available to you, just like any normal layer. You can change the opacity of the layers And the other thing that's really cool is that you have the layer styles available to you. So let's say, for example, I've got this type in blue, and I'm going to select this type and make it a little bigger, a little easier to see. And now I'm going to add a layer style, which can be accessed here, layer style, or using the effects button in the layer panel. But let's try a drop shadow. I'm going to move this panel so I can see what I'm doing, but you can see that I changed, as I update the distance of that drop shadow, I do have that ability. I can change the angle of the light, and I can change the size or the blurriness of that drop shadow. So you do have all of the layer styles available to you when working with the type layers as well. So that just gives you extreme flexibility. In upcoming demonstrations, we'll talk about with using type to create masks, using type with different channels. So there's a lot more available to you, but just knowing in this introductory demonstration that those elements are available to you is good news, and probably get your creative brains thinking a little bit. And this concludes the introduction of working with type.